What happened when the undercover CEO of Orion Robotics stepped onto the factory floor as a regular worker? He expected to see a well-run operation, but what he found instead was shocking. Exhausted employees, ignored safety concerns, and a manager who ruled with fear. Daniel Mercer had built his company from the ground up, trusting that his leadership team upheld the same values. But when reports didn't match reality, he took matters into his own hands, going undercover to see the truth for himself. What he discovered forced him to make a decision that would change everything. Let's dive into the story. Daniel Mercer had built Orion Robotics from the ground up, transforming it from a small startup into one of the leading robotics manufacturing companies in the industry. Known for innovation, efficiency, and high-quality production, the company had expanded rapidly, opening multiple factories to meet growing demand. On paper, everything looked perfect. Quarterly reports from senior management indicated smooth operations, high productivity, and steady growth. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to show. Despite the impressive numbers, troubling signs had emerged. Employee turnover was at an all-time high, customer complaints about delayed shipments were increasing, and whispers of worker dissatisfaction made their way to Daniel's office. When he questioned his leadership team, they dismissed the concerns, claiming that workers were simply struggling to adjust to the company's fast-paced environment. However, something about their responses didn't sit right with him. Orion Robotics had once been a place where employees feel valued, but now Daniel sensed a disconnect between the factory floors and the corporate boardrooms. Determined to uncover the truth, Daniel made a bold decision. He would go undercover as an entry-level worker at one of Orion Robotics' largest manufacturing plants. He would abandon his tailored suits, trade them for a factory uniform, and experience firsthand what his employees endured daily. His leadership team was unaware of his plan. He wanted an unfiltered, unscripted look at what was happening behind closed doors. Little did he know, what he would find in that factory would change the way he ran his company forever. Ditching his usual polished executive look, Daniel Mercer transformed into Dan, an entry-level assembly technician. He trimmed his beard, wore thick-rimmed glasses, and dressed in the standard blue factory uniform that every worker on the production floor wore. Gone were the suits, the corporate meetings, and the executive privileges. He was now just another worker trying to make it through a shift. With the help of an HR contact who was sworn to secrecy, Daniel was placed in one of Orion Robotics' busiest manufacturing plants, where the company's advanced robotic arms and automated systems were built. This facility had been flagged for high employee turnover and delays in production, making it the perfect place for his investigation. Upon arriving, Daniel was met with a hurried and indifferent reception. The factory manager, Edgar Ross, barely acknowledged him before assigning him to Hannah, a skilled but exhausted technician, for training. The lack of warmth in the onboarding process struck him immediately. There were no introductions, no orientation, just a quick rundown of tasks and a warning to keep up or be left behind. Hannah gave him a weary smile as she led him to his workstation, but her tired eyes told a different story. As Daniel started his shift, he quickly realized the brutal pace of the production floor. Workers moved rapidly, assembling robotic components, while navigating the constant pressure to meet quotas. Mistakes were met with sharp reprimands from Edgar, who seemed more focused on numbers than people. Daniel's first task was simple, assisting in the assembly of robotic arms, but even that proved challenging under the fast, relentless workflow. He noticed that breaks were rare, and employees barely had time to catch their breath before being pushed to complete the next set of tasks. Throughout the morning, Daniel kept his head down and observed. Hannah carried more than her share of the workload, covering for missing employees while Edgar barked orders without lifting a finger to help. As new workers struggled rather than offering support, Edgar dismissed them as too slow or not cut out for the job. The more Daniel watched, the more uneasy he felt. Was this really the environment his company had become known for? By the end of his first shift, his suspicions were confirmed. The management's reports had been hiding a toxic reality, and his employees were silently suffering, but Daniel knew he needed to see more before making his move. By his second day on the job, Daniel began to fully grasp the reality of the factory floor, and it was far worse than he had imagined. The constant hum of machinery, the smell of burnt metal, and the relentless pace of production created an exhausting environment. Employees were expected to assemble complex robotic components with little room for error, yet they had outdated tools, unrealistic deadlines, and almost no managerial support. What struck Daniel most wasn't just the physical exhaustion, but the mental toll the job was taking on his workers. He noticed that Hannah, his assigned trainer, was not only doing her own work, but also stepping in for others who had either quit or been let go. Every time a new worker struggled, Edgar, the factory manager, would snap at them instead of offering guidance. Miguel, a veteran technician, tried to explain an issue with one of the robotic arms that was malfunctioning, but Edgar brushed him off, insisting that speed mattered more than quality. Daniel could see the frustration on Miguel's face. He clearly cared about his work, but had given up on expecting change. During the lunch break, Daniel tried to engage in casual conversation with the workers, hoping they would open up about their experiences. Instead, most employees ate in silence, too drained to talk. Those who did speak were careful with their words, throwing nervous glances around, as if afraid of being overheard. When Daniel asked one of them, Ben, a young technician, about his experience working there, the response was disheartening. You keep your head down, do your job, and hope you don't get blamed for something that wasn't your fault, Ben muttered, before hurrying back to his workstation. As the day went on, Daniel witnessed one of the most jarring incidents yet. Miguel, who had been working on a delicate assembly, accidentally dropped a small but crucial part. The moment it hit the floor, Edgar stormed over, berating him in front of everyone. Maybe if you focused instead of whining about safety, you wouldn't make stupid mistakes, he sneered. Miguel looked humiliated, his hands clenched into fists, but he said nothing. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. This wasn't leadership. This was bullying. By the end of the shift, Daniel was exhausted, not just from the work, but from the weight of what he had seen. The company he had built was running on fear and pressure, not motivation or teamwork. He knew then that he couldn't just observe, he had to take action. But first, he needed to see just how deep the problem ran. By the end of his third day at the factory, Daniel could no longer ignore the growing frustration and exhaustion on the faces of his employees. The endless cycle of overwork, pressure, and lack of support had created a toxic environment where people operated out of fear rather than motivation. Every mistake was met with harsh criticism, and any attempt to voice concerns was swiftly shut down. The final straw came that evening when he found Hannah sitting behind a stack of metal crates, her head buried in her hands. Daniel hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. "Hannah, are you okay?" he asked gently. She flinched at first, quickly wiping her eyes, but when she looked up at him, her exhaustion was unmistakable. "I'm fine," she muttered, though the tremor in her voice told a different story. "You don't look fine," Daniel pressed, crouching beside her. There was a long silence before she finally let out a deep sigh. "I asked Edgar for a day off, just one day. I've been working overtime for weeks, covering for people who quit. He told me if I couldn't handle it, I should just quit too." She shook her head bitterly. "But I can't afford to quit." Daniel clenched his jaw, anger simmering beneath the surface. How did it come to this? How had his company, which he built on innovation and teamwork, become a place where employees felt trapped rather than valued? As they sat there, Miguel walked by and hesitated when he saw them. After a moment, he stepped closer. "If you're gonna quit, Hannah, take me with you," he said with a humorless chuckle, though the frustration in his voice was clear. Daniel looked up at him. "Is it really that bad?" Miguel scoffed. "Worse." He leaned against the crates and crossed his arms. "Edgar only cares about numbers. He covers up staffing shortages by forcing us to work double shifts, then tells corporate everything is fine. He ignores safety issues, and if anyone complains, they're either fired or worked until they quit. You think that's bad? We haven't had a real raise in 3 years." Daniel felt a sinking feeling in his chest. This was no longer just about a difficult manager, it was about a broken system that had been allowed to fester under his watch. That night, as Daniel lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he knew he couldn't wait any longer. It was time to reveal the truth and make things right. The next morning, everything would change. The next morning, Daniel Mercer walked into the factory, not as Dan the temp worker, but as the CEO of Orion Robotics. He was dressed in a sharp navy suit, a stark contrast to the dusty blue uniform he had worn for the past few days. The moment he stepped onto the production floor, the entire factory fell silent. Workers stopped what they were doing, their eyes widening in shock. Hannah, Miguel, and Ben stared at him in disbelief, realization dawning on their faces. Edgar, the factory manager, emerged from his office, looking irritated at the disruption. "What's going on here?" Edgar demanded, pushing his way toward the front. When he spotted Daniel, his expression faltered for just a moment before he quickly composed himself. "Mr. Mercer, I wasn't expecting you." Daniel crossed his arms, his sharp gaze locked onto Edgar. "I'm sure you weren't." His voice was calm, but there was a dangerous edge to it. "Let's talk in your office, now." The two men disappeared into the small, cluttered office. The workers outside whispered among themselves, tension thick in the air. Inside, Edgar attempted to regain control. "Mr. Mercer, if I had known you were coming, I would have—" "Spare me the excuses," Daniel interrupted. He stepped forward, placing both hands on the desk as he leaned in. "I spent the last 3 days working here undercover. I saw everything." Edgar paled. Daniel didn't hold back. He laid out every issue he had witnessed: the mistreatment of employees, the ignored safety concerns, the unpaid overtime, and the toxic culture Edgar had fostered. "You have been covering up staffing shortages, silencing complaints, and running this factory into the ground," Daniel said, his voice growing sharper. "You put numbers ahead of people. That ends today." Edgar opened his mouth to protest, but Daniel cut him off. "Effective immediately, you're fired." Silence stretched between them. Edgar's face turned red with fury. "You can't just—" "Yes, I can," Daniel said coldly. "Collect your things and leave." Defeated, Edgar clenched his jaw but said nothing more. He knew there was no way out of this. Without another word, he grabbed his belongings and stormed out of the office. The moment he stepped onto the production floor, the workers erupted into whispers, watching as their longtime tormentor walked out for the last time. Daniel turned to the employees. "I owe you all an apology," he said, his voice strong yet sincere. "I let this go on for too long, but I promise you, starting today, things are going to change." The workers stood in stunned silence, unsure if they could believe him. But then Hannah stepped forward, her eyes meeting Daniel's. "You mean it?" Daniel nodded. "I do, and you're going to help me rebuild this place the right way." For the first time since he arrived, Daniel saw something new in their faces: hope. 2 weeks later, Daniel Mercer returned to the factory, but this time as a leader ready to rebuild. The tension that once filled the air had lifted, replaced by an atmosphere of cautious optimism. Workers who had once moved mechanically, exhausted and discouraged, now greeted him with nods and small smiles. It was a start, but there was still work to do. The first major change had already taken effect. Edgar was gone, and in his place stood Olivia Tran, a seasoned operations manager known for her fair leadership and problem-solving skills. Unlike Edgar, Olivia walked the floor, spoke with workers directly, and wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty. Under her guidance, workers now had structured shifts, realistic production goals, and, most importantly, a voice in how the factory operated. But Daniel knew that one change in leadership wouldn't be enough. That's why he had spent the last 2 weeks overhauling factory policies to ensure a healthier work environment. Among the biggest reforms, mandatory safety inspections conducted weekly, led by none other than Miguel, who had been promoted to factory safety supervisor. His first act? Fixing the broken robotic arms and implementing a better maintenance schedule to prevent future hazards. Fair wages and proper overtime pay. No more empty promises. Employees would get paid for every extra hour they worked, with automated payroll tracking to ensure transparency. A whistleblower protection policy that allowed employees to report concerns anonymously without fear of retaliation. No more working in silence. Complaints would be addressed, not ignored. A structured training program for new hires, led by Hannah, who had been promoted to production team lead. For years, she had carried the weight of training employees without recognition. Now she had the authority and resources to do it right. As Daniel walked the floor, he stopped by Hannah and Miguel, who were reviewing a checklist together. "How's the new system working out?" he asked. Hannah smiled, looking more confident than he had ever seen her. It's like night and day, she admitted. We're still adjusting, but for the first time in a long time, it actually feels like we're being heard. Miguel nodded. People actually want to stay now. We've hired 5 new employees this week, and none of them have quit after the first shift. As they spoke, Ben approached, carrying a clipboard. Daniel was surprised. Before Ben had been hesitant to speak at all. I just wanted to say thanks, he said, for actually doing something about it. Daniel took the clipboard, flipping through the production numbers. For the first time in months, they were meeting their goals, without pushing workers to exhaustion. He exhaled, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. This was what leadership was about. Not just profits, not just efficiency, but people. And from now on, he would make sure they were never overlooked again. As Daniel stood outside the factory, watching the workers move with a renewed sense of purpose and energy, he knew one thing for certain. This experience had changed him as much as it had changed Orion Robotics. The past few weeks had opened his eyes to the real heartbeat of his company, the people on the factory floor. They weren't just numbers on a report or cogs in a machine. They were the foundation of everything Orion Robotics had built, and for too long, he had been blind to their struggles. Looking back, Daniel realized the biggest mistake he had made wasn't just trusting the wrong people, it was trusting reports more than his employees. The numbers had told one story, but the truth could only be found by stepping into their world and experiencing their challenges firsthand. He had always thought leadership was about making high-level strategic decisions, but now he understood that true leadership meant being present, listening, and acting when it mattered most. This experience had taught him 5 key lessons. A leader must understand their employees. Success isn't just about profits. It's about the people who create value every day. Ignoring their struggles leads to failure in the long run. A company's culture is more important than its bottom line. A toxic workplace might hit its targets temporarily, but in the end it will collapse under the weight of poor morale and high turnover. Taking action changes everything. Daniel could have just fired Edgar and walked away, but real change required long-term reforms and a commitment to employee well-being. Reports don't tell the full story. No spreadsheet or meeting could have revealed what he had seen with his own eyes. A good leader must be willing to get their hands dirty and experience the truth firsthand. When employees feel valued, the whole company thrives. Productivity had improved, not because workers were scared, but because they felt heard and respected. As Daniel turned to leave, Hannah ran up to him, handing him a small envelope. "What's this?" he asked. "Just a little something from all of us," she said with a smile. Inside was a simple thank you card signed by the entire team. "You didn't have to step in, but you did, and it made all the difference." Daniel closed the envelope, a rare warmth settling in his chest. This was what leadership was truly about, and from now on he would never let them down again.